It was a warm July afternoon in 1945 when Lena Redfeather, age 11, and her younger sister Marie, age 9, left their family's modest cabin on the edge of the Yakima Reservation in Washington. The girls had always been inseparable, playful, curious, and deeply connected to the land. Their mother had asked them to pick wild huckleberries from a nearby patch, something they had done countless times before. With small woven baskets in hand and sun hats tied under their chins, the sisters waved goodbye and set off into the forest, laughing, skipping, and completely unaware that they were walking into the heart of a mystery that would haunt their family for generations. The forest wasn't considered dangerous by the locals. The Redfeather family had lived near its edge for decades, and the girls knew its trails like the back of their hands. Still, their father had one rule: never cross the old wooden fence deep within the woods. It marked the border to federal land no one spoke about openly, but everyone respected. That morning, however, something was different. Thomas, their 15-year-old brother, remembered that the birds had stopped singing around noon, and their dog, usually calm, had barked in the direction of the forest for over an hour after the girls had vanished from sight. By late evening, worry began to settle in. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the girls still hadn't returned. Their mother lit a kerosene lantern and stood on the porch calling their names into the darkness. Their father, silent but tense, grabbed his coat and rifle and followed the trail toward the berry patch. Thomas joined him. The forest seemed heavier that night, dense, silent, and strangely cold. The berry patch was undisturbed, and no sign of the girls could be found. Only one thing stood out: a small red ribbon tied around a branch near the edge of the restricted zone. It was Marie's. Her mother had braided it into her hair that very morning. The community came together the next morning. Dozens of men and women from the reservation, along with local volunteers, combed the forest in rows, calling out Lena and Marie's names. Search dogs were brought in. Planes flew overhead. For nearly 2 weeks, the woods were scoured, but no footprints, clothing, or clues were discovered beyond that single ribbon. Even stranger, the dogs refused to go beyond the federal fence, whining, freezing, or turning around when forced near it. By the end of the second week, federal authorities arrived and abruptly ordered all search efforts near the restricted land to cease. Citing environmental concerns, the family was told to move on. The investigation was officially closed. But no one, not Thomas, not the girls' parents, not the tribal elders, believed that the sisters had simply disappeared. Whispers began to rise among the community. Some claimed they saw military trucks near the woods the night the girls vanished. Others reported strange noises and unnatural lights in the sky during that week. Elders warned that the forest beyond the fence was cursed, a place of old spirits and forbidden paths. Yet all anyone truly knew was this: Lena and Marie Redfeather walked into the forest on a sunny afternoon in 1945, and were never seen again. In the weeks following the disappearance, the Redfeather household transformed from a warm, laughter-filled home into a shell of sorrow and silence. Their mother, once known for her melodic humming as she worked, stopped speaking altogether, her eyes constantly fixed on the path the girls had taken into the woods. She would often sit outside at dawn, as if hoping the morning breeze would carry the sound of her daughters' voices back to her. Their father, a quiet man to begin with, grew even more withdrawn. He built a small fire every night, lighting it just beyond their porch, saying only that light calls the lost home. But the flames flickered alone, and the girls never returned. Thomas, then just a teenager, refused to give up. Every day after school, he returned to the forest. He traced and retraced the paths near the berry patch, followed animal trails, and even crossed briefly beyond the old fence, despite the warnings. He kept a notebook filled with crude hand-drawn maps and strange symbols he found carved into trees. He claimed he heard faint giggles once, like those of children playing in the woods, only to find nothing when he ran toward the sound. His obsession began to worry even his closest friends. But Thomas wasn't just grieving, he was searching. And deep down, something told him that the girls hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken. As months turned to years, the case faded from public attention. The town sheriff stopped responding to the family's calls. And even the tribal council, under quiet pressure from federal authorities, discouraged further inquiries. Files mysteriously went missing. The 2-week search effort became just a line in an old report. It was as if someone wanted the entire incident to be forgotten, erased from memory, buried beneath official silence. The family received no real explanation, no death certificates, no closure. Just a few hollow words. No foul play suspected. But the Redfeathers were not convinced, and neither were many others in the reservation who had seen and heard too much. Stories began to circulate in hushed voices. A former forest ranger claimed he was reassigned after reporting unauthorized vehicles near the restricted zone days before the girls disappeared. An elder recalled hearing distant mechanical humming at night, like machines underground. And then there was the strange letter that arrived in the Redfeathers' mailbox 2 years later, unsigned, typed, and sealed in a plain envelope. It simply read, "They were not alone in those woods. You were never supposed to know." The family took it to the sheriff, who dismissed it as a cruel prank. But Thomas kept the letter hidden in a metal box under his bed, reading it over and over until the paper nearly tore in half. Still, the community around them remained divided, some loyal, some fearful. A few relatives urged the family to move away and start fresh, while others whispered of curses and ancient spirits tied to the land. Thomas noticed how people stopped meeting his eyes in public, how conversations halted when he entered a room. Over time, the Redfeathers became a symbol of quiet tragedy. People pitied them, but no one dared to speak too openly. It was as if a shadow had settled over their name, and everyone was afraid to look into it too closely. But Thomas had already made a silent promise to his sisters. No matter how long it took, he would uncover the truth. The old wooden fence that stretched across the deeper parts of the forest was more than just a boundary, it was a symbol of fear, mystery, and unspoken truths. Erected during World War II under the guise of federal conservation efforts, it divided the woods with almost surgical precision. On one side, the trees swayed peacefully in the wind, full of life and familiar sounds. On the other, the forest seemed older, heavier, untouched by time. Locals knew better than to cross it, not because they were told not to, but because of what they felt when they neared it. Animals avoided it. Winds changed direction at its edge. And people who dared approach it swore they felt watched, even followed. After the girls vanished, the area near the fence became the center of growing suspicion. The ribbon Marie left behind wasn't just close to the boundary, it was tied to the very last branch before the restricted zone began. Thomas was sure it was a message, or worse, a warning. But when he tried to bring this to the attention of the authorities, he was met with cold stares and repeated phrases like "there's nothing there" or "you're imagining things." Yet, he knew what he had seen. Not long after, he witnessed unmarked trucks entering a service road that led behind the fence. Trucks that vanished without sound into the shadows of the trees, never to return. The stories among tribal elders only made things more unsettling. For generations, they had spoken of a stretch of land deep in the forest that no hunter dared enter. A place said to be watched by the stonewalkers, ancient spirits that could not be seen or touched, but whose presence was felt in every snap of a twig and every breath of cold air. Some claimed these entities protected sacred ground. Others whispered that they punished those who disturbed it. When questioned about the Redfeather girls, the elders would grow silent, often turning their gaze toward the mountains beyond, muttering prayers under their breath. It wasn't just grief that made them quiet, it was fear. Strange phenomena only fed the mystery. Glowing lights were reported over the treetops at night, not like lanterns or flashlights, but soft blue orbs that pulsed silently, as if watching. Electrical interference became common for homes near the forest edge. Radios crackled with unknown voices, and compasses spun uselessly. A hunter once reported finding a deer frozen mid-stride, not dead, just utterly still, staring into the trees beyond the fence, its eyes wide with terror. He never returned to the woods again. All of this only added fuel to Thomas's obsession. He began keeping a journal not only of what he saw, but of what others whispered in passing, mapping the lore, the facts, and the unexplained into a growing web of clues. The more Thomas dug, the clearer it became. Whatever had happened to his sisters wasn't natural, and it wasn't random. He believed something, or someone, was operating in the forbidden zone, something protected by layers of silence, government barriers, and centuries of fear. But the deeper he searched, the more alone he felt. His questions were met with avoidance, his sightings dismissed, and his warnings ignored. Still, he knew in his heart that the fence wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something else in. For decades had passed since Lena and Marie vanished. But for Thomas Redfeather, time had done little to dull the ache, or the questions. Now 55 years, old Thomas carried the grief like a scar no one else could see. He had served in the military, traveled across the country, and built a quiet life far from his childhood home. But he never stopped thinking about his sisters. Every birthday, every holiday, and every time he walked through the woods and other parts of the country, he imagined them frozen in time, still out there, still waiting. And so, when whispers spread that the federal land near Yakima was being quietly declassified and the fences removed, Thomas knew this was his moment. He packed a single bag, left his job without a word, and returned to the place where everything had ended. When Thomas arrived back at the reservation, he found the landscape eerily unchanged. The forest still stood, vast and untamed, though time had weathered some of its secrets. The once barred zone was now just a rotting fence line with rusted metal signs half buried in moss. Armed with his old notebook and his sister's photos, he stepped across the boundary for the first time in 40 years. The air felt thicker, heavier, not just with age but with something else. He moved carefully, retracing the route he believed the girls might have taken for 2 days. He camped beneath the towering pines, listening. The forest spoke in rustles, whispers, and distant creaks. He began to feel it too, that same sensation others had described, of being watched on. The third morning, something caught his eye beneath a tangle of roots near an old stream. It was metallic, weathered by time, but unmistakably familiar. With trembling hands, he unearthed a rusted tin lunchbox, its lid dented, its latch long broken. On its surface, scratched faintly into the metal, were the letters M.R. Marie Redfeather. Inside, time had all but erased the contents, save for a tiny, brittle scrap of paper. Though barely legible, one word could still be read: cold. Thomas sat in stunned silence, unsure if what he held was real. If this box had survived, had they, or had this been left behind in a final, desperate moment? Driven by this discovery, Thomas pressed deeper into the forest. Following a trail that didn't appear on any map, a path almost hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and twisted vines. After nearly an hour of pushing through bramble and brush, he found it, a collapsed wooden structure, half swallowed by the earth, a cabin, or what remained of one. The wood was blackened by rot, the door torn off its hinges. Inside were fragments of a life-interrupted rusted cutlery, a child's shoe, a cracked ceramic mug. But what truly stopped him were the markings on the walls. Dozens of carvings, some words, others symbols he couldn't fully interpret. One sentence repeated over and over again in uneven handwriting: "They watch at night. We can't go back." Each step deeper into the cabin felt like a descent into something ancient and wrong. Thomas found a child's sweater buried beneath floorboards, small enough to belong to Marie. He fell to his knees, clutching it, as a flood of emotion broke through. Years of quiet endurance. But even through his tears, one thought burned brighter than the rest. Someone else had been here with them. The structure wasn't built by 2 little girls. There were signs of food storage, hand tools, even wire remnants on the ceiling beams. This hadn't been just a hiding place. It had been used, maintained, perhaps even watched. And whatever had happened here, Thomas was now standing at the edge of it, staring into a truth far more terrifying than he ever imagined. The cabin Thomas stumbled upon didn't appear on any maps, nor was it mentioned in any local archives or government documents he had accessed in the past. It was as though it had never officially existed, a phantom structure buried deep within the woods, waiting to be discovered. The walls had been overtaken by vines and creeping moss, but beneath the rot and age, it was clear this place had once been actively used. Its construction was too deliberate, too well hidden to be a random shack or abandoned hunter's hut. The rotting beams were reinforced with steel bolts, and its foundation dug slightly into the hillside, like someone had wanted it both concealed and protected. Inside, the smell was sharp with mildew and something else, something metallic and bitter that made the air feel heavier the longer Thomas stayed. The floor creaked with every step, and dust rose in thick clouds, disturbed after decades of silence. Near the corner, beneath a collapsed shelf, he spotted a pair of small, dirt-stained shoes. One was missing its laces. They looked about the right size for Marie. Nearby was a torn moth-eaten blanket and a rusted tin cup. On the far wall were strange drawings, stick figures, symbols, and what looked like a crudely carved spiral. But the thing that chilled him most was a series of vertical lines scratched into the wooden beam, like someone had been counting days. There were over 400 marks. Thomas examined every corner of the cabin, documenting what he found with a shaky hand in his journal. He discovered fragments of broken glass, possibly from a shattered lantern, and what looked like charred firewood in a long-dead hearth. Yet, Nothing inside suggested true comfort or safety, only survival. Most disturbing of all were the words, etched deeply into the wood near the floorboards, likely carved by a child's hand. "We are watched. We are not alone." The letters were uneven, jagged, as if carved in haste or panic. He ran his fingers over the grooves, imagining his sisters afraid, cold, writing messages in the dark as something loomed just beyond the thin wooden walls. Behind the cabin, Thomas found a partially collapsed hatch hidden beneath a thick tangle of bramble. It led to a shallow crawlspace, too small for an adult, but just big enough for two frightened children. Inside, it was lined with straw and old newspapers from the 1940s. Most of the articles were about military operations and wartime propaganda, but one headline stood out: "Unknown aircraft sighted over Northwest Forest." Someone had kept those clippings. But who? Had the girls hidden there? Or had someone kept them there? The implications tore at Thomas's mind. This wasn't just a place his sisters might have stumbled into, it may have been where they were taken. The cabin's location, its deliberate secrecy, the haunting evidence inside all pointed to something orchestrated, something controlled. But by whom? And why would such a place exist within the boundaries of land once locked down by federal authorities? As Thomas stepped back into the fading daylight, the forest no longer felt like a natural place. It felt like a shell, a thin green veil hiding something built for silence, secrets, and perhaps suffering. When Thomas returned from the forest, carrying photographs, sketches, and the rusted lunchbox as physical proof, he knew he could no longer keep this to himself. He contacted a local journalist, someone he had trusted from his younger years, and shared everything. Within days, a brief article appeared in a small regional paper titled "Veteran Claims: New Clues in 1945 Disappearance of Native Sisters." The response was immediate and deeply unsettling. Instead of renewed interest in the cold case, Thomas began receiving anonymous calls at odd hours, long silences, clicks on the line. Then, within a week, the article vanished from the newspaper's archives. When Thomas called the editor, he was told the piece had never existed. Determined not to be silenced, he filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act, asking for all military and federal activity reports connected to that specific section of the Yakima Forest between 1940 and 1950. What returned months later was a folder half filled with blacked-out pages and fragmented reports. But between the redactions, one thing stood out. In 1943, the U.S. government had leased part of that forest to a now-defunct branch of the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. The official reason was behavioral stress response research in controlled isolation environments. There were no further details, no explanation of what was being tested, no list of subjects. Just an abrupt line dated 1946. Operation Sunset, closed. All assets destroyed. That term Operation Sunset burned in Thomas's mind. He took it to a former military contact, who confirmed it had appeared in a few obscure government briefings related to containment efforts. During early Cold War experimentation, the files were buried deep, and mentions of it were always vague, almost deliberately so. But what he did find was even worse. Rumors of unsanctioned experiments on small, controlled populations, mostly indigenous or remote communities, often without their knowledge or consent. One document noted that environmental manipulation and long-term isolation conditioning were being explored in regions deemed expendable due to sparse populations and federal land access. It was a polite way of saying, no one would ask questions out there. As he pieced this puzzle together, Thomas began to realize his sisters may not have simply wandered into danger. They may have been observed, even chosen. What if they had been taken by someone running these secret tests? The cabin, the missing government files, the strange symbols, it all fit together in a way he didn't want to believe. Even more disturbing, the few files he was able to recover hinted that some subjects exhibited strange psychological symptoms: hypersensitivity to sound, fear of mirrors, memory loss, and an intense belief that they were being watched even after isolation ended. These weren't just side effects. These were results the researchers were measuring. But Thomas wasn't alone in being watched now. He began to notice the same black car parked across the street from his house late at night. His mail started arriving already opened. A stranger approached him in a grocery store, shook his hand firmly, and whispered, "You're digging into things meant to stay buried." The next morning, Thomas's front door was unlocked. Nothing was taken, but a single item had been moved. The tin lunchbox. It had been placed on the kitchen table, open, with the word "stop" written on a new slip of paper inside. Whether it was a threat or a warning, Thomas didn't know. But it was clear. Someone still cared very deeply about keeping that forest's secrets hidden. Haunted by the warning left in his home and disturbed by the pieces he'd uncovered, Thomas could no longer ignore the quiet truth rising in his chest. If he wanted real answers, he'd have to return to the place where it all began, the forest. But this time, he wouldn't go alone. He reached out to several tribal elders, the last generation who still remembered the girl's disappearance and the silence that followed. Though most were reluctant, a few agreed to join him. Not because they believed they'd find peace, but because they too had lived with the weight of unspoken fears for too long. One elder, Margaret Whitebird, told Thomas, "Something was disturbed in that forest. If the ground is ready to speak, we should listen." On a cold morning in early October, they hiked back to the ruins of the hidden cabin. The air felt brittle, the forest strangely quiet. The group moved slowly, whispering prayers in their native tongue, leaving small offerings of tobacco and cedar along the way. Thomas led them to the area behind the collapsed cabin, the same place where the earth had felt uneven beneath his feet weeks before. There, near the tree line, the ground bore faint signs of disturbance, a slight dip in the soil, old branches broken in unnatural patterns. With a quiet nod, one of the elders handed Thomas a small ceremonial digging stick carved with protective symbols. They began to clear the dirt in silence. Only a few inches down, the soil changed color, darker, wetter, heavier. Then came the unmistakable scrape of wood. A crude plank, partially rotted, formed a lid. Beneath it, wrapped in aged blankets and bits of rusted fabric, were skeletal remains, small, fragile bones, 2 sets. Though time had taken its toll, certain things remained painfully intact: a tiny beaded bracelet, and a red ribbon still tangled in a clump of matted hair. Thomas collapsed to his knees, breath caught in his throat. Even without official confirmation, he knew sisters had been here. They had died here. But the ground held more than just their bones. Nearby, buried separately, the group uncovered pieces of strange metallic fragments, curved smooth and unnaturally warm to the touch. Even in the cold forest air, no one could explain what the fragments were. They didn't appear to be part of any known machinery. There were no markings, no serial numbers, no rust, as if they had resisted time itself. One elder refused to touch them at all, whispering that they were not of this world. Others noted that the area surrounding the burial site was unusually silent. No insects, no birds, no wind. It was as though the forest had frozen, waiting. Thomas collected what evidence he could: bones, fabric, metal, and placed them carefully into wrapped bundles. But as they turned to leave, one of the elders noticed something carved into the back of the nearest tree, nearly invisible beneath. Years of bark growth. Scraped deep into the wood in crude lettering were 4 words. "We lived, they watched." The discovery made headlines briefly, but soon after, the news cycle shifted, and officials refused to classify the findings as anything other than an unofficial burial site of historical interest. DNA testing confirmed what Thomas already knew. The bones were Lena and Marie, but the cause of death, undetermined. Officials claimed decomposition made it impossible to draw conclusions. The strange metallic objects, taken in for federal analysis, never to be seen again. Still, questions buzzed behind closed doors. Who buried the girls there? Why were they hidden so carefully? And what role did the cabin, and possibly the government, play in their final days? Thomas had found answers. But with them came more terrifying questions. Ones that still hadn't been answered. Thomas never stopped searching, not just for answers, but for understanding. He spent the rest of his life documenting everything he had discovered. The files, the forest, the warnings, the strange silence that swallowed his sisters and nearly swallowed him too. He passed it all on journals filled with scribbled theories, photographs of the cabin, and tape recordings of the elders who walked with him into the trees. Before he died, he left a final note tucked into his journal. It read, "We were never meant to find them, but they wanted to be found." To this day, that part of the forest remains off limits again, quietly reclassified by the government under conservation protections. The cabin has collapsed completely, and the grave is now overgrown, but hikers still whisper of strange lights flickering between the trees, of voices that echo when no one is near. Some believe the spirits of Lena and Marie still wander, waiting for the truth to come out. and others believe the truth was never meant to be known, because in the quiet shadows of that forest, something is still watching.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.